another place that the endowment effect comes into play is with my very, very, very favorite Coase theorem. I'll generously call it an illustration. So a few weeks ago, you may have read in the news that 3 flights were grounded because people were arguing about whether people were allowed to recline their seats on the airplane. And rather than bargain, figure it out, do anything that Coase would have suggested, poor man's rolling over in his grave probably right now, they decided to throw drinks at each other and cause enough of a ruckus that the planes had to make emergency landings. So, you can think about, in this Spock-like world, what does the Coase theorem predict? We have the Coase theorem, we say, okay, Coase's point was that it doesn't matter from an efficiency perspective how property rights are assigned if people are able to costlessly bargain. That if people can bargain, they'll get to the efficient outcome, and the only thing that'll matter, or the only difference that we'll see, is what monetary transfers take place. So we have an article here by one Josh Barrow writing in the New York Times. So his thing is like, all right, you want me to not do this? Well, pay me. That would be exactly how the Coase theorem should work. So he's sort of taking the Spock perspective to this. But unfortunately, or fortunately in some ways, I'm not going to be totally judgmental, but unfortunately for the purposes of our economic models, we live in a world of humans. So we get responses such as this from Hamilton Nolan at Gawker: don't want me to spit on you when you recline your airline seat, pay me. So there seems to be some argument about where the property right lies as the first point, but also some barrier to rational bargaining, right? Because we can think about, well, what should happen? If we lived in a world, what would 2 Spocks do? Just for the sake of argument, you say, Spock A, the value of him reclining is $20. Spock B, the value of legroom is $15. We can see from this that the efficient outcome is for Spock A to recline, because he values his right to recline more than Spock B values his legroom. And we can also see that if these Spocks are bargaining, this would happen regardless of whether they were told, hey, you have the right to recline, Spock A, or, hey, Spock B, you have the right to your legroom. Because if Spock A is told that he's allowed to recline, he's just going to be like, tough cookies, Spock B, I'm reclining. And that'll be the end of it. If Spock B had the right, Spock A would be nicer. He would come along and be like, hey, buddy, I know you like your legroom, but maybe we can come up with a deal that works for both of us. Say I offer you like $18 for you to not complain when I recline my seat. Spock B would be like, I'm offered $18 for something that I value at $15. Yeah, sure, okay. Spock A would be willing to do that because he's only paying $18 for something that he values at $20. We would still get to an outcome where Spock A reclines. There would just be a monetary transfer involved. That's what the Coase theorem tells us. Now let's think about what 2 humans would do, presumably other than throwing drinks at each other. We said that the endowment effect caused people to inflate their valuations when they were in the position of a seller. So if we had the property rights assigned to the recliner, what would happen? They would say, well, I have this property right. Do I want to sell it? Well, I'm only going to be willing to sell this property right if the other guy's going to give me $40. Human B is going to say, well, I'm in the position of a buyer. I'm only willing to pay $15. And we would end up with an outcome. We got willingness to sell at 40, willingness to pay at 15. No trade happens. Human A reclines the seat. So far, so good. We haven't explicitly broken the Coase theorem yet. But let's try the flip side of that and say, well, what happens if property rights are assigned to the person wanting their legroom? And saying, hey, that knee defender is cool. That button on the seat to recline, that's the thing that's really evil. So then we would have human B being in the position of the seller and human A being in the position of the buyer. So human B would say, well, I am subject to the endowment effect. Okay, maybe they're not that self-aware. They would say, well, my willingness to sell is $30. Human A would say, well, my willingness to pay is $20. Again, you get no trade happening, but you don't get to the same outcome as you did before. That now we're living in a world where there's no reclining, which is not what the Coase theorem says. So you say, well, wait a minute. We can, through this simple example, show how learning a bit about behavioral economics can help explain why we're seeing things in the world that don't seem consistent with those basic models that we were taught. Not consistent both because people tend to exhibit this irrationality in valuation, but because people have an aversion to bargaining in general. You know, I kind of on the plane on the way here really wanted to try and do this with someone, but I didn't want a drink thrown at me. I didn't want to be on the no-fly list, so I didn't actually try. But you can think about how awkward that would be with actual people, that we don't necessarily live in a world where bargaining is costless. We live in a world where people are sometimes shy. They don't want to ask for things. And even the simple fact of people shying away from bargaining could drive us away from this Coase theorem result. Interestingly enough, we have some data on the actual valuations. So we don't have to just say hypothetically, oh, say people are behaving in this way. Say people are subject to the endowment effect when talking about airline seats. We could go to the numbers and show that people actually feel this way. So people were polled. They were asked to put themselves in the hypothetical scenario of someone trying to buy either the right to recline or the right to legroom. And in each case saying, well, how much do you value this? You know, if you were given the right to recline, how much would you need to be paid in order to stop reclining? If you were given the right to legroom, how much would you have to be paid to not have your legroom? And then the flip side. And we're seeing results that are pretty close to what we would expect with that factor of 2 multiplication that we talked about earlier. It's just a very simple proxy. That when people were given the right to recline, they said on average that they'd require $41 to give up that right. But if they didn't have the right to recline, they'd only be willing to pay $12 for it. So not a factor of 2, we have a factor of about 3.5. And given these numbers, the initial allocation of property rights would really matter. That regardless of how we put the property rights in place, that outcome would stay. So, you know, what you can take from this is when we're dealing with humans, we have to consider, oh, hey, guess what? The initial allocation of property rights actually can matter. We can basically think of this irrationality as a transaction cost, in that we can't guarantee that we're always going to get to the objectively efficient outcome. So you can say, well, what do we do with this? You know, I gave you 2 examples. And say, well, how can I go through? You know, I already have too much to do, and I know that that's a common issue, that, you know, we try to do microeconomics in one semester. You're already, you know, booking it through your material going, oh my goodness, I'm going to run out of time at the end of the semester. You know, how can we think about incorporating this in when we're actually doing the material rather than tacking it on at the end if we have time, right? And so, you know, what you can do is basically a variant of what I did here. All I've done is say, hey, given what I know about behavioral economics, where does this fit in? Let me sit down for a little while and say, how would I need to modify this model? What information would I need to present to students? You know, how can we play around with this? And there's a lot of different places that you can do this. This was just 2 examples. And you can do that on a one-off basis to largely allay those concerns of students to say people don't actually behave like that. Because if you say, in response to a criticism of people don't actually behave like that, well, yeah, but just go with this model, students are going to turn, you know, they're going to turn off, right? So we can actually specifically indulge them and say, you're right, but wait, we can talk about that. The problem here is that figuring out where to put these behavioral concepts in your course material. Of course, you know, I started out here with an explanation of prospect theory and explanation of the endowment effect. You got to know a little bit about behavioral economics. So like, oh, if I don't know what I'm supposed to be sticking into these models, I can't get very far. So one of the main challenges for instructors is that the way we were taught, you know, in our basic courses themselves, we weren't specifically given this information. That now, you know, a lot of us have to go back afterwards and say, okay, how do I get enough of an overview of this material to at least think about how to apply these basic concepts? And it's not insurmountable. It's not hard. You know, this wasn't conceptually difficult. We didn't do a lot of math. It's just about knowing what concepts and what biases are out there, which, yes, does take effort on the part of the instructor, but it's my personal view that that's very much worth it. So for some shameless self-promotion, if you do want a nice little overview of behavioral economics, I actually wrote a chapter in the book that you see here that's about the economics of The Simpsons that uses quotes from The Simpsons, uses storylines from the show to illustrate a lot of the concepts that we talk about in behavioral economics. Therefore, in doing so, not by its main purpose, but almost by accident, the chapter actually shows, because the show has been on for so long, because the examples are so robust, it actually gives a decent overview into the concepts that behavioral economics studies and looks at. What I'll also do for you, for those of you who are curious, so this is my website, and that explains the graphic that you've been seeing this whole time. But I'll put up these slides if you want to revisit them. For example, I said that you have this overview of topics in behavioral economics you might want to look at, stuff like that. And I'll also put some links to helpful materials if you do feel like exploring this further. I'm always happy to take questions, work with people, point them in the right direction, and so on and so forth. So hopefully this is something that is at least of a little interest to you, so that we can start putting this out to students, so we have a more realistic model of the world, something that students can relate to more, that they can attach to more, that they can trust incrementally above what we're currently giving in our principles courses. Thank you.